The clinking of champagne glasses stopped the moment my mother's voice carried across the patio. "Colleen? Oh, she's just our little cautionary tale," she laughed, sharp and cruel. That was the exact moment I realized my mother didn't just misunderstand me. She actively needed me to fail. In the affluent, manicured suburbs of Oak Creek, reputation wasn't just everything. It was the only thing. My mother, Barbara, was the undisputed queen of our local social circle. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to the grocery store and viewed her children not as independent human beings, but as accessories to be paraded around at country club brunches. If you fit the mold, you were polished and displayed. If you didn't, you were hidden away. Or worse, used as a prop to highlight her own martyrdom. I was the prop. Our family dynamic was established early and enforced brutally. My older sister, Savannah, was the golden child. She possessed a natural, effortless grace, inherited my mother's icy blonde beauty, and brought home report cards that looked like straight rows of picket fences. By the time she was 22, she was engaged to Preston, a handsome old-money orthopedic surgeon. My younger brother, Declan, was the genius. He was a loud, arrogant kid who could solve a Rubik's Cube in seconds, and was constantly excused for his atrocious behavior because he was supposedly destined for Silicon Valley greatness. And then there was me, Colleen. I wasn't bad at school, but I wasn't exceptional in the ways my mother understood. I had a chaotic, restless energy. I dismantled appliances to see how they worked. I bought bulk candy from wholesalers and ran a highly lucrative black market tuck shop from my locker until the principal shut it down. When I tried to show my mother my profit margins, I had made nearly $800 in 2 months. She looked at me with undisguised disgust. "You look like a common street peddler," she had sneered, tossing my ledger into the trash. "Savannah just made the dean's list, and you're selling cheap chocolate to children. When are you going to grow up and stop embarrassing me?" The older we got, the wider the chasm grew. After high school, I skipped college. The idea of sitting in a lecture hall for 4 years, racking up debt to learn theories I could test in the real world, felt suffocating. Instead, I took a job as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized freight brokerage downtown. It was unglamorous, gritty, and smelled perpetually of stale coffee and diesel fuel. But to me, it was a masterclass. I watched how goods moved across the country, learned the desperate bottlenecks of supply chains, and realized there was an absolute fortune to be made in logistics if you were willing to hustle harder than the next guy. My mother, however, saw it as the ultimate failure. To her, I was an uneducated secretary working in a warehouse district. The breaking point arrived on Thanksgiving of 2018. My mother had invited the extended family, including Aunt Martha, the family's unofficial town crier, and Uncle Richard. The dining room was an overwhelming display of crystal, silver, and suffocating tension. We were midway through the turkey when Aunt Martha leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with a hunger for gossip. "So, Colleen, still answering phones for the truck drivers?" Before I could even open my mouth to explain that I had actually just been promoted to a junior broker, my mother sighed. It was a loud, theatrical sigh that commanded the entire table's attention. "Oh, Martha, let's not press the poor girl," Barbara said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "We've accepted that Colleen just isn't cut out for the kind of success her sister and brother are meant for. Savannah is planning a June wedding in Tuscany, and Declan just got accepted into that prestigious tech incubator." "I'm a broker now, actually," I interjected, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm managing my own accounts." My mother let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Brokering trucks, how quaint. I told my friends at the club that you're just finding yourself, but between us, it's a tragedy. I've given her every opportunity, and she's determined to be a failure. She'll be living in a cramped apartment, scraping by for the rest of her life. She's my cross to bear." The silence in the room was deafening. Savannah looked down at her plate, a small, smug smile playing on her lips. Declan didn't even look up from his phone. I looked at the faces of my family, my blood, and saw nothing but pity, contempt, and agreement. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my plate. I simply stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out the front door into the freezing November night. I blocked their numbers by the time I reached my car. I knew then that I didn't just need to move out. I needed to disappear. The next 3 years were a brutal, solitary grind. When I cut ties with my family, I also cut ties with the financial safety net I had occasionally relied on. I moved into a dilapidated studio apartment on 4th and Elm, a neighborhood where police sirens were the nightly lullaby, and the heating was merely a suggestion. I quit the brokerage firm. If I was going to kill myself working 80-hour weeks, I was going to do it for my own name, not someone else's. I founded my own freight logistics company, Apex Solutions. In reality, Apex Solutions was just me, a second-hand Dell laptop, 2 prepaid cell phones, and an ironing board I used as a standing desk. The beginning was a nightmare. The logistics industry is ruthlessly competitive and dominated by established good old boy networks. I was a 20-something woman, cold-calling grizzled warehouse managers and exhausted truck drivers, begging for a chance to move their freight. I faced constant rejection, blatant sexism, and crushing self-doubt. There were nights I sat on the floor of my freezing apartment, eating generic brand ramen noodles, crying so hard my ribs ached. I missed the comfort of my old life, even if it came with a side of emotional abuse. Occasionally, I would look at Savannah's public Instagram. It was a highlight reel of perfection, the Tuscan wedding, the enormous diamond ring, the luxury vacations to Aspen and St. Bart's. Declan was frequently featured, giving TEDx-style talks at local colleges about his revolutionary app. Meanwhile, my electricity was shut off twice because I prioritized paying my business insurance over my utility bill. My only friend during this time was Silas, a gruff, 60-year-old independent dispatcher who took pity on me. Silas taught me the intricacies of reefer, refrigerated freight, a highly volatile, high-stress, but incredibly lucrative niche. "You've got the grit, kid," Silas told me over diner coffee one rainy Tuesday. "Most people run from the hard loads. Produce, pharmaceuticals, stuff that spoils if a truck breaks down. You take that on, you own it, and companies will pay a premium for your peace of mind." I took Silas's advice to heart. I made myself available 24/7. When a truck broke down in the middle of the night in rural Nebraska, carrying $80,000 worth of frozen poultry, I didn't sleep. I spent 6 hours calling every tow company and mechanic within a 200-mile radius until the problem was solved and the delivery was made on time. Slowly, agonizingly, I built a reputation. I wasn't just reliable, I was relentless. Then, the first twist of fate occurred. It was late 2021. The global supply chain was collapsing. Ports were backed up. Trucking capacity was non-existent, and major corporations were bleeding millions because they couldn't get their inventory onto store shelves. It was a crisis for the world, but for independent brokers who knew how to creatively route freight, it was a gold rush. Because I had spent years building deep, personal relationships with independent trucking fleets rather than relying on massive corporate carriers, I suddenly had access to trucks when no one else did. A mid-sized national grocery chain, desperate to move a massive backlog of dry goods before the holiday season, took a gamble on Apex Solutions. I delivered. I worked 90 hours a week for 3 months straight, coordinating hundreds of shipments. By the end of the quarter, my little ironing board startup had generated over $2 million in gross margin. But I kept my mouth shut. I didn't buy a new car. I moved out of the slum, yes, but only to a modest, quiet townhouse. I incorporated offshore, set up a trust, and made sure my name was deeply buried in the corporate paperwork. The trauma of my mother's words, "She's a failure, she's a cautionary tale," had fundamentally altered me. I didn't want my family's validation anymore. I wanted to build an empire in the shadows, entirely untouchable by their judgment. While my bank accounts were swelling, the facade of my perfect family was beginning to crack. I found out through Aunt Martha, who had finally tracked down my email address to send me her annual, thinly veiled brag letter. But tucked between the lines of forced cheer was a strange bit of gossip. Savannah and Preston were downsizing to a smaller home. The truth, which I would uncover months later through a private investigator I hired just to keep tabs on them from afar, was much darker. Preston wasn't just an orthopedic surgeon. He was a high-stakes gambling addict. He had quietly drained Savannah's accounts, taken out massive second mortgages, and was facing a malpractice lawsuit that was bleeding them dry. Savannah had gone to my mother, begging for help, sobbing on the pristine living room carpet. But Barbara, terrified that her country club friends would find out her perfect son-in-law was a degenerate gambler, refused to let Savannah leave him. "You stay and you smile," Barbara had reportedly told her. "We do not do divorces in this family. We do not air our dirty laundry." And Declan, his revolutionary app, had burned through $2 million of angel investor funding without ever launching a viable product. He was quietly let go from his own company, returning to live in his childhood bedroom. Yet, to the outside world, my mother was still spinning the web. On Facebook, Savannah was renovating a chic new property, and Declan was taking a well-deserved sabbatical to consult. And me? I was still the punchline. I still heard the echoes of my mother's voice, telling everyone who would listen that I was the lost cause, the one who couldn't make it. I smiled at my computer screen, watching the 6-figure wire transfers clear into my business account. Let them think I was a failure. The real twist was just around the corner, and they were wholly unprepared for the storm I was about to bring to their perfectly manicured doorstep. By the spring of 2024, Apex Solutions was no longer just a freight brokerage. It was the cornerstone of Cobalt Holdings, a massive logistics and supply chain conglomerate that I had built from the ground up. I acquired distressed trucking fleets, invested in automated warehousing, and bought out my competitors while they were still trying to figure out how to survive the post-pandemic market corrections. I was 31 years old, entirely self-made, and my net worth had quietly crossed the 9-figure mark. Yet, if you Googled my name, you would find absolutely nothing. I employed a rigorous team of corporate attorneys, led by a ruthless and brilliant man named Harrison, to ensure my identity remained buried beneath layers of LLCs and non-disclosure agreements. I lived in a breathtaking penthouse overlooking the city skyline, but to my family in Oak Creek, I was still the ghost who couldn't cut it. The collision course began with a single, innocuous file dropped on my mahogany desk by Harrison. We're looking at acquiring a portfolio of distressed debt from a boutique private equity firm in Chicago, Harrison explained, adjusting his glasses. Most of it is standard commercial defaulting, but there's a significant chunk of high-risk personal loans secured against luxury assets. One of the primary debtors caught my eye. I remembered you mentioning the hometown. I opened the manila folder. There, printed in stark black and white, was the name, Preston Hayes, Savannah's husband. The file detailed a financial massacre. Preston hadn't just dabbled in high-stakes gambling, he had decimated his life. He owed nearly $4 million to creditors. Worse, the file showed who had co-signed the final, desperate loan that had kept Preston out of federal prison for embezzlement. My mother, Barbara. She had leveraged the deed to the Oak Creek estate, our ancestral home, the very epicenter of her social power, to guarantee Preston's debt. "They've defaulted," Harrison stated quietly, knowing the gravity of what he was presenting. "The firm is moving to foreclose on the Oak Creek property next month. If Cobalt Holdings acquires this portfolio, we acquire the debt. And the deed." I stared at the paperwork, my pulse a slow, heavy drum in my ears. For years I had built my empire to escape them, to prove to myself that I wasn't the failure my mother had declared me to be. But fate, it seemed, had a deeply ironic sense of humor. "Buy the portfolio," I instructed, my voice devoid of emotion. "Fast track it. I want Cobalt Holdings holding that paper by Friday." While the ink was drying on the acquisition of my family's financial ruin, another thread of my past intertwined with my present. My brother, Declan, was still aggressively playing the role of the misunderstood genius. After being ousted from his first startup, he had spent 2 years conceptualizing a new venture, an AI-driven predictive modeling software for, ironically, supply chain logistics. He had been pitching to every venture capital firm on the West Coast and was finally granted a meeting with Vanguard Ventures, a premier seed funding firm. What Declan didn't know was that Vanguard Ventures was a subsidiary of Cobalt Holdings. It was my money. I couldn't resist. On the day of his pitch, I sat in the executive viewing room, hidden behind a two-way mirror. Declan walked into the boardroom looking older, slightly desperate, but still wearing that familiar, arrogant sneer. He pitched his software to my board members with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its attention. His software, however, was a joke. It was derivative, impractical, and clearly designed by someone who had never actually spent a day working on a loading dock or routing a distressed shipment. Through my earpiece, I fed questions to Mitchell, my lead investment director. "Ask him how his algorithm accounts for spontaneous port strikes in secondary South American markets," I whispered. Mitchell repeated the question. Declan floundered. He threw out buzzwords, machine learning, synergistic scalability, but he had no real answers. He was a fraud, wrapped in expensive tailoring. "Pass," I whispered into the mic. Mitchell closed his portfolio. "We appreciate your time, Declan, but Vanguard is going to pass. The underlying architecture lacks real-world applicability." I watched through the glass as Declan's face crumpled. The golden boy, utterly defeated by the sister he thought was answering phones for truck drivers. He packed his briefcase with trembling hands and walked out. He had no idea I was the one who had just severed his last lifeline. The trap was now fully set. I owned Preston's debt. I owned the impending foreclosure on my mother's house. And I had just shut the door on Declan's only hope for redemption. It was time to go home. My mother did not go quietly into the night. When the formal foreclosure notice was officially served by Cobalt Holdings' legal team, I expected a quiet, shameful retreat. I should have known better. Barbara Hayes spun the narrative with the desperate, clawing ferocity of a cornered animal. Word reached me through the same private investigators I kept on retainer. Barbara had brazenly announced to the Oak Creek Country Club that the family estate was simply too large for just the two of us now, and that she and my father were choosing to downsize to a chic, manageable villa in a gated community. To cement this grand illusion, she decided to throw one final, extravagant garden party to say goodbye to the house. It was a masterclass in sheer, unadulterated delusion. She was completely bankrupt. Her son-in-law was facing absolute financial and professional ruin. Her genius son was unemployed and sleeping in his childhood bedroom. Yet there she was, ordering imported white orchids by the dozen and securing catering from a Michelin-starred chef in the city. She was putting it all on her last, frantically unmaxed credit card, desperately maintaining the polished veneer even as the wood rotted beneath it. The eviction and transfer of possession was scheduled for the Monday following the party. Sitting in my glass-walled office, looking out over the city I had conquered, I told Harrison to draft a specific, non-negotiable addendum to the paperwork. The anonymous buyer would be doing a final walk-through of the property during the Sunday afternoon garden party. When Sunday arrived, Oak Creek was bathed in that heavy, golden, late summer sunlight that always made the neighborhood look like a real estate brochure come to life. I sat in the spacious back seat of an idling black Maybach at the end of the long, achingly familiar driveway. I could see the sprawling green lawn, dotted with pristine white tents. A string quartet was playing a lively Vivaldi piece that drifted over the manicured hedges, mingling with the polite, high-pitched laughter and the clinking of crystal champagne glasses. It looked exactly like the Thanksgiving dinner from 6 years ago, just moved outdoors. "Ready, Miss Hayes?" Harrison asked quietly from the front seat. He had his leather briefcase resting on his lap, a stoic executioner holding the axe. "Let's go," I said, my voice steady. My heart, however, was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. There was no joy in this, only a profound, necessary finality. The heavy tires crunched aggressively against the pristine white gravel as the Maybach pulled through the towering iron gates. We didn't stop at the valet stand. We drove directly past the bewildered attendants, the massive vehicle gliding like a shark through shallow water, and parked squarely in the center of the circular driveway, right in front of the grand main entrance. The Vivaldi faltered. A cellist missed a note, and then the music simply stopped. The polite chatter died down in a wave of sudden, uncomfortable silence. Every eye in Oak Creek turned to the tinted windows of the vehicle, the guests murmuring behind their hands, wondering which mysterious, tasteless billionaire had purchased the Barbara Hayes estate and decided to crash her farewell soiree. My driver stepped out and opened my door. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air. I wasn't wearing a cheap polyester blend from a discount department store anymore. I wore a sharply tailored, slate-gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than my first car. A vintage Cartier watch rested coolly against my wrist. But more importantly, I wore the cold, unyielding posture of a woman who commanded fleets, negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, and bowed to no one. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw Aunt Martha, standing near the oyster bar, literally drop a delicate canapé onto the grass. I saw Uncle Richard take off his wire-rimmed glasses and rub his eyes as if trying to wipe away a mirage. And then, standing at the top of the sweeping marble steps of the patio, I saw her. My mother. Barbara's frozen, perfectly practiced smile shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The color drained from her face so rapidly I thought she might faint, leaving her looking haggard, hollow, and incredibly old. The pearls at her throat suddenly looked like a noose. Savannah, standing next to her with Preston holding a flute of champagne, gasped aloud, her hand flying to her chest. Declan just stared from the edge of the patio, his jaw slack, a half-eaten shrimp cocktail suspended in his hand. I walked up the steps, my heels clicking sharply against the stone. Harrison flanked me, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over the sunlit party. The silence was absolute. You could hear the wind rustling the ancient oak trees that lined the property. "Colleen," my mother whispered, her voice trembling, stripped of all its usual haughty resonance. "What? What are you doing here? You're ruining my party. Security." She looked around frantically, as if a bouncer would magically appear from the hydrangeas. "There's no security, Barbara," I said, my voice carrying clearly, effortlessly across the patio. I didn't call her Mom. I hadn't had a mother in years. "I'm here for the walk-through. I believe the new owner is entitled to inspect the property before taking full possession tomorrow at 8 a.m. The new owner?" Savannah stammered, stepping forward, her designer dress suddenly looking entirely out of place. "You? Colleen, what is this sick joke? You work in a warehouse." I looked at my sister, the golden child, whose perfectly curated life was currently crumbling beneath her designer heels. I felt a brief flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her smug smile over Thanksgiving's turkey. "I own warehouses, Savannah," I corrected her softly, but with enough edge to cut glass. "Millions of square feet of them, along with the logistics network that supplies them." I didn't break eye contact with her as I reached out a hand. "Harrison." Harrison unclasped the briefcase with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot. He pulled out a thick stack of legal papers and held them out. When my mother refused to take them, her hands shaking at her sides, he simply placed them on the small wrought-iron table beside her. "I am the majority shareholder of Cobalt Holdings," I stated, turning to address the family, though I knew the entire town was hanging on every word. "Which means I am the entity that purchased the distressed debt portfolio from your creditors in Chicago. I own this house now. But more importantly," I turned my gaze slowly to Preston, who was sweating profusely, his face the color of old parchment. "I own your husband's debt, Savannah, all $4 million of it." Preston staggered backward, bumping into a tray of champagne flutes and sending them crashing to the stone floor. Savannah let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with both hands as the reality of her utter destitution crashed into her. "You..." Declan stepped forward, his eyes wild with a sudden, horrifying realization. He looked from me to the briefcase, his mind finally processing the corporate structures. "Cobalt Holdings. They own Vanguard Ventures. You were the one who killed my funding." "I didn't kill your funding, Declan," I said smoothly, turning my attention to the brother who had mocked my intelligence for decades. "Your algorithm was derivative, fundamentally flawed, and failed to account for basic real-world volatility. It was a glorified spreadsheet. I just refused to let my company waste capital on a fraud." My mother was shaking violently now. She reached out and clutched the legal documents to her chest, crinkling the heavy paper as if holding them tight could magically shield her from the truth. The facade was gone. The guests, her beloved, judgmental country club friends, Aunt Martha, the entire town, were watching in morbid fascination as the great Barbara Hayes was dismantled piece by piece on her own patio. "You set us up," my mother hissed, venom finally replacing the shock, her eyes burning with a hateful fire. "You malicious, ungrateful little wretch. You did this to humiliate me, after everything I did for you." "You did nothing for me," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a deadly, icy calm. I stepped one pace closer to her, invading her space, forcing her to look at the woman I had become. "You told everyone I was a failure. You needed me to be the punchline, so you wouldn't have to look at the rot festering in your golden children. You bet against me, Barbara. And you lost. I looked around at the gaping crowd, at the manicured lawns and the crystal glasses catching the afternoon light. It all looked so small now, so incredibly insignificant. I had spent years running from this place, terrified of its judgment, only to realize they were trapped in a cage of their own making. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow to vacate, I said, turning my back on them and walking down the marble steps. Leave the keys on the kitchen counter. I'm having the place bulldozed on Tuesday to build a distribution center. It was a lie. I had already quietly arranged to donate the property and the land to a foundation that built transitional housing for battered women. But the horrified, ragged gasp that tore from my mother's throat was worth the deception. I walked back to the Maybach, the crisp white gravel crunching beneath my expensive shoes. The silence of the crowd was heavier than a thunderstorm, completely suffocating. I got into the back seat, Harrison sliding in next to me, and the door shut with a solid, satisfying thud that severed my ties to Oak Creek forever. As the car pulled away, leaving my family standing paralyzed in the wreckage of their own making, I didn't look back. In the end, success wasn't about the money or the estate. It was about reclaiming my narrative. The girl they cast as a failure wrote the final chapter, proving that the brightest futures are often forged in the shadows of rejection. I walked away from the wreckage of their expectations, finally free. They kept their fragile illusions, but I walked away with the only thing that mattered: the truth.